Good afternoon, everybody. Khambrel Marshall here, KPRC Channel 2 meteorologist and host of Houston Newsmakers. And I will be lucky and I'm excited about being able to host our online coverage on election night as we will follow every moment of what's going on the national and local scenes. Mario Diaz is our investigative reporter as well. He's going to be covering the elections. Mario, good to see you. Are you covering anybody specifically on election night, Mario?
At this time, I believe I'm in the Harris County district race. And I know actually I'm in the district attorney's office race for Harris County. But I just want to clarify, and thank you so much for having me here this afternoon, Khambrel. But you are, aside from being who you are with Sunday's Newsmakers and someone who is a meteorologist here and a very, very good one here at KPRC, you are also someone who understands Texas politics as best as any of them out there. So let's not sell yourself short here, Khambrel.
Well,
when it comes to politics in Texas, especially in the Houston area, you are one person that we all can lean on and we can all talk to about it.
Well, my shoulders are getting heavy, so stop it. Thank you for that, Mario. But you're right. I'm a geek. Grew up in a household where we discussed politics around the dinner table, so that was kind of an interesting scenario. But let's talk about 2020. I think Robert Arnold may be joining us a little bit later. If he does, great. More to the party. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss what's going on here locally, specifically in Texas and in the Houston region. And if any of you have questions, and we already have a couple, we'll address those in a little bit, but you can go into the chat and be able to write those questions down, and we'll be able to get to them and just talk about them a little bit.
And we should welcome all our friends that are watching from all over on this right now, in terms of people who are watching from the Graham Media Group at other stations in Michigan, in Virginia, in Florida. This is interesting because we know there's a lot of interest in those states as well that are similar to Texas, I think much more established as battleground states because of prior elections. But there's no doubt, Khambrel, as you and I both know, this state is one that is very much up for grabs in certain areas of the state right now. And we can tell by how much we are seeing with the vast amount of campaigning and election dollars that are being raised,
right,
well as spent in the state of Texas.
And another thing about that, and many of you in your local areas probably are seeing this as well, ad after ad after ad after ad, political commercials on TV. And a lot of that in our state has to do with the fact that we don't have straight ticket voting anymore.
Right.
And so people who are down ballot aren't relying so much on people just clicking Republican or Democrat. They've got to get their names out there and try to be able to talk about themselves in a way that's going to attract attention.
Not a state that understands who the person is when they register to vote.
Right. By the way, you mentioned our Michigan and Florida connections, and I've worked in all of those on behalf of this company. So the Graham Media Company has been very good for me over the last near 40 years that I've been in this business doing what we do. So, but 2020 has been not just Texas, but everywhere. Right. It is obviously a year that many of us want to forget because of COVID, but it's also created a whole subset of conversation on the political scene because of coronavirus, right?
There's no doubt that the pandemic has had an impact, but you will talk to people on both sides of the aisle. And I think since we're starting about the pandemic, which is obviously encompassing everybody in this nation, in the world, let's look at the federal race first. Let's talk about the presidency. I think, Khambrel, probably best to kind of move ourselves down from the presidential race to perhaps the congressional races here in Texas, and then end with our state races. And there's a huge component to the state races that makes us unique this year. And it is important for everyone to truly understand about why you're seeing so much spent on these local House races that normally people are like, it's a House race, right? Not in Texas this year. Khambrel, you and I both know that. We'll talk about that later. But let's get back to the federal component here. What's intriguing about this presidential cycle here is that for the first time that anybody that I've spoken to about this time around, let's talk about the investment. You're seeing Democrats truly invest in terms of the top two candidates, and obviously in the former Vice President Biden as well as Senator Harris come into Texas with advertising, as well as Senator Harris coming into town to visit and to campaign. And that is on the horizon here in the near future. Those are the type of last minute treks you haven't seen in the state of Texas, the last minute advertising purchases that you haven't seen. And mind you, former Vice President Biden's purchases for advertisement here in Texas has been also hitting the Latino networks. And
Right.
it was a few weeks ago. It wasn't done here in the last couple of days. So there is a strategy in play by the Democrats of either saying, hey, we have this opportunity to take this, or is it that we have to shore up our defenses with certain communities? Is President Trump making inroads in some communities that in the past have been in our favor? Those are the questions. They're going to be answered, obviously, on Tuesday night. But when I talked to every expert that I've spoken to about this, and I said, what's really driving this election cycle from the last 4 years? And they say, well, it's the White House. It's the individual that's in charge. Whoever you're backing, whether you're for the president or whether you're for the former vice president, it's whoever's in the office that's driving that vote one way or the other, which is intriguing.
Right.
This cycle, because as most people will tell you, there hasn't been a presidency like this one ever before, which is why we're seeing that combined with the pandemic of this turnout that we haven't seen in the past.
And separate from that, a couple of years ago, when Beto O'Rourke was running against Ted Cruz, he lost by with 3 percentage points. And Democrats across the country were enthused by that because he only lost by that margin. And thought, well, within the state, that's going to help us as well. And the latest margins, the latest polls regarding the state, Real Clear Politics average has President Trump up by 2.5 points. You look down and you see some of the other polls. The Dallas Morning News has Biden up by 3. And then Rasmussen Reports, which is typically always not Republican, pro-conservative, it leans Republican, and has Trump up by 7. So the Real Clear Politics has it up by 2.6. So that's clearly within a margin of error. And so both sides are trying to make sure they get themselves in the hunt really early. And that's why all the money is being tossed in. And by the way, Mario, I know we'll get down to the state house races as well, but a lot of money is poured into the local races here recently as well, because Republicans realize that it's very important for them to hold on to those seats, a lot of those seats as well. We had a question, somebody made a question really quickly, Mario, about early voting numbers and whether or not they're going to be counted ahead of time and all that kind of stuff. Different states have different methodologies. Some states don't even start counting until November 3rd, which is crazy, if you will. But Texas, we'll get that dump early on. As soon as we close the polls on Tuesday night, the first information that comes in will be the early voting numbers. We'll get those up. So right off the bat, we'll get a chance to analyze those numbers. We had, as you mentioned, we had record-breaking numbers of people who came out to vote and are still coming out to vote, not only here in Texas, but across the country. But we'll get a chance to find out from that strata what that might mean, if that's a prelude to other things that might be going on the rest of the evening or not. We'll be able to get some early indications from that early dump when it comes out right after the election. I know a lot of us will be looking at those numbers with really keen interest, Mario.
Khambrel, there's no doubt. 2 key points that we've talked about, if we can revisit, the 2018 Beto O'Rourke, Senator Cruz campaigns, as well as the early voting. I'll start with the early voting component first. Recently, Channel 2 traveled to Oregon, a state that established all-mail voting back in the mid-90s. It was quite intriguing to go there and see that. But I asked them, when do you start processing your votes in Oregon? And they said they process them 7 days out. They don't release what's going on, of course, but they start to process them a week out. It's significant, he said, and this was talking to Steve Trout, the director of elections, supervisor of elections, I should say, for the state of Oregon. And he was saying, what concerns me about some of these other states that haven't been in tune with this type of early voting numbers in the past, that haven't seen these surges of numbers in the past, is that they're going to start counting the night of the election. And in a key battleground state, not to mention we are a battleground state right now in the eyes of many, but in some other states where it's truly a key battleground state, he was pointing to those as being a concern for him because, as you indicated, some don't start counting until the night of the election. Oregon is one of those states that's different. Now, you mentioned Ted Cruz and why we're seeing Beto O'Rourke, the campaign, and the enthusiasm left in the hearts of Democrats back in 2018. Even though they lost, they raised a significant amount of money for a Texas race. So what did that force here in Texas? It also forced Republicans that perhaps in the past would have been able to say, hey, we have this Senate seat. This is a Republican state. It forced them to spend money in Texas in an area they weren't traditionally used to spending that kind of money in. And at the same time, what anybody will tell you in politics, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, is that when you're able to force your opponent to spend money in the backyard, what you're doing is that you're making the party as a whole bleed with campaign contributions that in the past would have gone to other districts in the state or other races in the state, as well as other races elsewhere. And that's what was the significance of 2018 here in Texas. And you saw it a little bit in 2016 with, at the time, the former First Lady and Senator Clinton cutting into the margins as well, is that you were seeing the numbers start to get a little bit closer. And as a result of that, you were able to say, well, look, if we spend more money here and we do a better job of trying to get people registered, or perhaps we get our message out more, we start to capitalize on how Texas is growing, then you know what? Then there's going to be a lot more money on the other side spent in their backyard, which is money that could be impacting races elsewhere. And that was the biggest takeaway from what happened on the night of 2018, when you really break it down, is that we became a state where the money in the past was going elsewhere. Not anymore. That money's coming into Texas and it's staying here to defend it.
Well, you know what? And that's what many people talked about. And we've talked about it through the years as well. Democrats have been harping on the fact that they're going to turn the state blue and maybe purple and all that. And of course, when Beto came close in 2018, they started thinking a lot more. Well, you know, it's been a long time since anyone's been elected to a statewide office in the state of Texas. Jimmy Carter in '76 was the last president who won the state. So that is one of those pieces of the puzzle as well, that now Democrats think that there's a better chance because of what's going on in the White House. You made this point early on. There are people who are on either camp. You either are all in with the White House, or there's very few in between. We go into this, you notice there's very few undecideds as compared to the previous elections. Have you noticed that, Mario? That this time around, they're a much smaller group. And that's why the pollsters are out there saying, look, the margin of error may be what it is, but we just don't think that their election night, there's going to be that many people going to come in and change the balance of what's going on based upon what we can see right now. I don't know about you, but there's this thing in the back of my mind that says, polls, I'm not sure. I don't know. I know what the polls are saying. I was on the air 4 years ago when we were getting the returns in for the election then. And when the numbers were coming in, it was like, okay, wait a minute. Michigan, Wisconsin, those states, wait a minute, who won those? That's not what it was supposed to be. So it's going to be very interesting. I really like your insight, Mario, because I know you've had political experience on the ground working in the political environment. So you know what that's like. That insight is very valuable.
And I was inside the room in Manhattan in 2012. I was working for a TV station in New York City at the Hilton at the time. And when you looked at those numbers, I remember examining certain states beforehand. And this is what the campaigns are doing, whether it's in the federal component or whether it's at the local level. They're looking at certain neighborhoods that they know are what they call the battleground streets or the battleground neighborhoods. That's what it breaks down to. You have a state, and then you go into the county, and then from that county, you go into a specific neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, you might even be targeting certain streets. And what happens is, especially at the local races, and what happened was in 2016, you saw certain counties, and this is what people should look for on election night is, how did that county go in 2016? And what you saw in North Carolina, I remember 4 days before, they were getting some early voting polling that was showing that certain counties that voted one way in 2012 were coming back the other way in 2016, which kind of said, I remember talking with some colleagues of mine and saying, hey, I think there might be a very good chance here that we might see a surprise. Because these numbers in different states, that if everything aligned up properly, there could be that presidency and that upset. And that's exactly what history showed us. With regards to the polls this time around, you're still going to have people that say, I don't trust the polls. Mm-hmm. And you're also going to have people that are going to come out and say, I'm not voting for this president. Or if I was voting for this president, I'm not going to tell you if I'm going to vote for this president for whatever reason.
Right.
That happens in all elections. Some would say it's much more heightened this time around. Right. So I think that what this election is going to show us on Tuesday night is how accurate are the polls 4 years later. And I think that trust level come Wednesday morning into the polls is going to be either into a new dimension of trust with regards to polls, or people are going to be just saying, yeah, the polls, you just can't trust them, period. It's the second
Right.
election in a row now that we're looking at this.
I was listening to
the numbers are intriguing for what we're seeing right now, but again, you're seeing polls all over the place with regards to Texas. You have some that are saying that the vice president is up. You have some that are saying that the former vice president, I should say. You have some that are saying the president is up. I will tell you that if the Biden campaign did not feel like they had a legitimate shot at winning Texas, they wouldn't be campaigning here this close to Election Day. And that obviously is key for them. As of right now, I don't know of any visits planned by the Trump administration. I reached out and talked to people. Are the siblings coming into town? Are the children coming into town? When I say the siblings, the children of the president, there's nothing on tap. And you can tell that the Republicans in this case, I was because we have our monitors in our room, and Khambrel, you know exactly what I'm talking about here in our newsroom. You can see we have like 7 monitors, and you can see what's going on in all the networks. And yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, the day before, I saw the president in Bullhead City, Arizona. And Bullhead City, Arizona is a very, very tiny town, very small town. So there must be something within their strategy or their game plan that's saying, hey, we can afford to go to Bullhead City and shore up our line there or try to make a play there and then hit Arizona on the backside, which is what I think what happened there. But I was like, wow.
And I'll tell you what that is. You know, I started my career in Arizona, so I know that area pretty well.
Right.
And there are 11 electoral votes there. It's a swing state. And most of the voting numbers that would be pro-Democrat are coming from the Maricopa County and Pima County areas, which is the Phoenix metropolitan area, and Tucson metropolitan area. So from those areas, that's the stronghold. So the biggest areas that they're going to be able to take advantage of are those areas outside, like Bullhead City, for example. Yeah, and it wasn't in Phoenix, but it was out in those outside areas where they were hoping to be able to really enhance those numbers to make a difference. So they know that it's like within the margin of error within Arizona in the presidential race, not so much in the Senate race where there's a different ball game there, but in the presidential race, it's close enough. They feel they want to get those rural areas to get them on board. That's why Bullhead City, which is a lot smaller than a lot of other places. But you're right, in Texas, we've seen the money being spent here by Democrats. They've got the Soul of America trip that started today, going through the next several days here with Vice President candidate Kamala Harris is going to be in several cities, including Houston, on Friday as a part of the push to try to get those numbers out to make a difference in the state.
We've got a couple of questions here, and Khambrel, I'm hoping that you might have a little bit more insight on some of these than I do at this time, as I'm still playing catch up on some of this as we're working, because we're all working here. But, first off, one of them is, why is 2020 different from 2016 with regards to Democrats? Why do they claim they have a chance? I think we've kind of discussed this already and showing that you had these performances in the past. The numbers, they feel that even though the registration doesn't show who you were with, that's all decided by the voters. They just feel like they're having a stronger turnout right now. Did opening up the sports arenas in Houston make a difference during early voting? And that's an interesting topic, Khambrel, because we're seeing it all over the place.
Well, and the key thing about that is that I don't know that it did, but it didn't hurt. Certainly, we had so many different early voting locations around. Those places were advantageous for people to go, but we had such a huge outpouring that I don't know that it would have made a difference really in terms of the overall number. People thought that was a pretty neat thing to do. The interim Harris County clerk has been very aggressive in trying to open up as many opportunities for eligible voters to take part in the electoral process. That's one of the things he's done. Of course, you notice that he wanted to have more places where you could drop off those mail-in ballots. Of course, the governor issued a mandate, said that couldn't happen, but all the other places, they've been really going and taking advantage of those. And now, of course, we're in a period here in Houston where we got this 24-hour cycle where places are going to be, 7 locations are going to be open for 24 hours all the way up until tomorrow at 7 p.m. Now, most of the voting places open 10 o'clock in many other nights, but tonight, 24 hours all the way until tomorrow at 7 o'clock. So that's another way that they really are increasing the opportunity for that person who gets off on the midnight shift, gets off at work and he's it's too late for me to vote. I don't want to get up too early. Well, this kind of takes away the excuses for getting out there and doing things. So this is one of the ways that they've really enhanced the ability for people to get out and vote if they want to be able to do that as well.
And I'll tell you right now, the times that I've seen and the times that I went, there was no line. There wasn't, because it was a huge surge those first few days. And then afterwards, it was kind of like, okay, well, a lot of people have already voted. They wanted to vote. And then you continue to move forward. The question is, how much is this going to impact? It is going to be there. I mean, in Texas in 2016, I believe the number was 59% for the presidential turnout.
Right.
So I'm expecting the number to be much higher this time around. I think that enthusiasm from both sides. I think that changing demographics in terms of the number of people that have been here, the type of people that have moved here since 2016, those that have become eligible to vote, I think you're going to probably see a higher turnout, Khambrel, but I don't know if it's going to be up to that 70% mark. But here's the history about Texas that we've talked about, is that Texas has one of the lowest turnouts when it comes to presidential elections in the nation.
Yeah. Yeah. But we're already trending above that right now. I mean, the numbers are going off the charts in the early voting at this point. And they're hoping that those numbers will be indicative of what's going on.
Several counties, I know Fort Bend, several counties are already eclipsing the numbers that they saw in 2016 for early voting. And here we are with still 4 days to go. And when I was at the Smart Financial Center, it took us a few minutes to go in there and vote. There are people in line, but you watched it, you saw the process, and you get in and out and you move on. Having those facilities established early on, as well as other locations around for early voting, no doubt has helped get this process done more simply and smoother. So we don't have that logjam come election day, as many are expecting.
There was another person who wrote in and asked, could people vote if they have a felony? And Texas law said, if you have completed your sentence, you can vote. So that's kind of a big issue in Florida, I know, where people were finishing, and they put in a law just recently to be able to allow ex-felons to be able to vote if they've done their time. And of course, that became a big issue because not only have they done their time, but they have to pay restitution if they were part of their penalty was not only time served, but also a fine. If they haven't paid that, that's been a big problem going forward. So I think people around the country, when they look at Texas, they know that Texas is a, quote, red state for the most part, but within our congressional districts, there's a real battle going on. I want to touch upon that if we can. One of the most visible ones that people would recognize.
There are several, Khambrel. Which one's going to be the most?
What's that?
I said there are several that are very visible right now.
Well, just Dan Crenshaw is very visible only because of his stature. He was the only one from the Texas delegation to be able to speak at the Republican National Convention. And of course, he's a former Navy SEAL who lost his eye in battle on behalf of protecting this country. And so he is in the 2nd Congressional District. He is a freshman running for the first time. Of course, he took over the seat that was held by Ted Poe, who retired, and Dan Crenshaw took over there. Now, the 2nd Congressional District here in the Houston area is gerrymandered in a way that really favors Republicans. Ted Poe was, far right conservative, although he was in the Freedom Caucus at one point in time. He got out of the Freedom Caucus because the Freedom Caucus was too far to the right for him, but that's another story. So Dan Crenshaw is running, very visible nationally, got a lot of money coming in. There are a lot of people who are supporting him. And he's running against, the person who's running against him is Seema Lahjavardian, who is a person who actually was on the staff of Beto O'Rourke and learned kind of what was going on there. She's Iranian American, came to this country, I think, when she was 9 years old from Iran, and has quite a bit of following here, but it's an uphill climb for her to try to challenge someone like Crenshaw, who has been quite the popular person. And she has said that she's counting on the changing demographic. Harris County, of course, in 2016 went blue, as it did through 2018 as well, although it wasn't a national election. But across the county, there were so many Democrats who won. We still had straight ticket voting. So they just came in and voted across the board to just get rid of it. Almost all the people who were Republicans just voted them out. And so in this case,
Harris County, which is viewed as arguably the largest county in the state of Texas in terms of the voting and the amount of people that are coming in and what you're seeing, we know it's the 4th largest county in America. 20% of the vote that has come in already is 20% of the vote will be by people under the age of 35. And we look at that number and you understand that it's already a blue county. That is an area that's a challenge area
Right.
If you're on the other side, if you're the Republicans, because you're saying, that has been a dominant blue county in many ways. However, as you indicated, the congressional districts are carved in a manner in which it allows for parties to capitalize on that in certain instances,
Sure. Sure.
and to work the campaigns that they need to either retain or to capture that seat. You talk about another example. You have the Wesley Hunt race against Lizzie Fletcher, which we've seen a lot of ads are. Again, another former military individual, and Wesley Hunt going against the incumbent, Ms. Fletcher, who defeated John Culberson, and it used to be held by President Bush.
George H.W. Bush's district. And so that really was a smart for the Republican Party there.
And then there's that big race. Which one am I thinking about out in Fort Bend County? Khambrel, which one's that one? We're talking about
Troy Nels and Sri Preston Kulkarni, which is a big deal. Sheriff Nels, former military as well, sheriff, and Sri Preston Kulkarni. That seat is open, by the way, because of Congressman Olson, who's retired. Mm-hmm. And so when he retired, that gave these opportunities for people to come in. Sri Kulkarni lost to Olson, not by very much, 3 to 4 percentage points back in 2018. So that gave him a sense that, okay, I may be able to do this next time around. Well, by the next time around, Olson had retired, and now Sheriff Nels has now jumped in. And Sheriff Nels has a fair amount of visibility because he is a Fort Bend County sheriff. He's very visible in a lot of different ways. He is a twin brother, Trevor Nels, who's running for sheriff, as he's been constable. So they've been very visible in Fort Bend County. But Fort Bend was also a county that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and that's what gave Kulkarni the chance, or thought that he would be able to come as close as he did to try to beat Olson, this last time around. And so it's a changing demographic county as well, much like the area that we're talking about, the second congressional district. By the way, I want to go back to that just for a second. The second congressional district with Dan Crenshaw and Seema Lajavardian is not all in Harris County. It stretches up into the Woodlands area and the Montgomery County and those areas there. But Seema was saying that she was counting on the changing demographic within the second district to give her an advantage when it comes to voting for or against Dan Crenshaw. We'll see how that works itself out.
And I think that's really the strategy for anybody that's running against the right, is that you're counting on the changing demographics of Texas in many ways to be a benefit for you. And there's no doubt we're seeing a change in the demographics in Texas with the young voters that are coming up, as well as those that are moving into the state. But you're seeing it, again, on both sides. Let's not forget, as I was talking to somebody earlier about this, with regards to 2018 and what you saw there, you saw all of this money come in against Senator Cruz. And at the end of the day, it was like, wow, this is a ton of money. This election was very close. But the Republicans still to say, hey, we still won that race.
Yep.
And you talk to them and they're saying that's the confidence that they have with regards to this coming Tuesday. But in a county like Fort Bend, where you have that race, and I think the one thing that stands out for many, if you're not familiar with this county or these names, Nels and Kulkarni are the two individuals. What's really stood out about this race and what has people talking is the amount of mud that has been slung at each candidate in this race. It's been very, very eventful with regards to negative politics, and you're hearing it from both sides. And this is the third party ads that we're talking about too, Khambrel. We talk about all this money coming in Texas. A lot of money is being spent by third party groups that have no connections to Texas on both sides, and they're based in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, and they're spending money to have an impact in one way or the other. And you're seeing it in this race in particular.
Someone asked the question about whether or not we expect to see long voter lines. I know that we had the last couple of elections here, we just had an awful, there's no way to spin it, Mario. It was just an awful image. The optics were terrible in terms of how people had to vote. And one of the places in particular was Texas Southern University, where it's in the heart of the third ward, which is a predominantly
Right.
black area. And they had people
Right.
who were standing in line until midnight voting. Now, obviously, if they got in line by 7 o'clock, they were allowed to vote, and they did that. But that was one of the problems, and there were problems all over the place. There were a lot more machines in Republican areas than there were Democrat areas, and so the areas where they were expecting that the highest turnout, they had the fewest machines. In the areas where they had the less turnout, they were plenty of machines there. So I would think this time around, as I said, the interim clerk, Chris Hollins, has led the way in making sure that, like him or not, in terms of what he's doing, he's making the effort to make sure that eligible voters will be able to vote. So the number of places that people will be able to vote on election day is tremendously higher than it was back in 2018 or 16 or the primary elections we had this year. It's going to be a whole different ballgame. We should not see those kinds of lines in Harris County. I don't know about Fort Bend County in terms of the numbers. I would think that they also have increased, and they've been a little bit smarter about how they place the machines. The biggest optic, we didn't see that kind of problem in Fort Bend or Montgomery or any of the other outlying counties. But in Harris County is where we saw those huge lines. It was just outrageous. But they've done a good job in trying to make sure that they could get those things taken care of.
And it's not just to get a person's vote heard, which is obviously part of the democratic process. People need to have their votes counted. Right. They need to have their votes heard. But you're also seeing this as a result of the pandemic, which is something that they're doing everything possible to make sure that people are safe while having their voices heard. Khambrel, you kind of touched on this a few minutes ago. Let's talk about the state races, if you don't mind, and why in a state like Texas. Khambrel, you there, buddy?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. I went away for a second to check the chat. Somebody asked a question. So,
but the state races, they're significant this time around because as a result of the census this year, that means that those congressional districts come 2021 will be drawn up by whoever is in control of the Texas House.
Right.
Why we're seeing such a huge push on these House races, unlike ever before, according to various campaigns I've spoken to.
Right. And political scientists we've had on the Houston Newsmakers program have indicated that as well. And so they have said that the Democrats have to flip 9 seats to take control of the House in the state of Texas. And many of those seats, several of those seats are right here in the Houston area. So it becomes very interesting. And we've seen commercials from them. We've never seen commercials from these folk up until now.
I'll give you an example. So I was speaking with one campaign earlier. They're an incumbent on the Democratic side, and they're fighting in a tough fight. And they were telling me that their guy won by under 2,000 votes in 2018. At that time, that election cost them just under $100,000. That's how much money they raised and spent. They're now expecting between $700,000 to $800,000 for this particular campaign this time around. And why is that? Because they'll tell you that they want their guy to win. People believe in their guy and they want him to win, but they also admit, this is a chance for Democrats for the first time. And I'm not sure exactly the history on this, and forgive me for not having it ready to go, to actually have control of the Texas House to where they can redraw the congressional districts for their favor. You won't see this amount of money spent in Texas races again, according to most, until 2030, the next time we have a census count, which is why. Go ahead, Khambrel.
And it is very interesting in what goes on, because we have several races throughout that are people who are running for seats that have been vacated. So that's what really made the Republicans who decided I'm not going to run anymore. And Democrats said, okay, that's our shot. And one of them is House District 26. That's in Fort Bend County. Guy by the name of J.C. Jatan and Sarah DeMarchand. And J.C. Jatan, very interesting for him, there's a guy named Rick Miller was the incumbent there. And you might have seen this. It got a lot of news when it first happened. Rick Miller was the incumbent. And as he was being challenged by some people in the primary, they both happened to be Asian heritage, Korean American and something else. I'm not sure what the other person was, but they were both had Asian heritage. And so Rick Miller said, well, the only reason they're running is because they're Asians. in this changing demographic of Fort Bend County. And that just got a lot of uproar. And so people who had been supporting him, including the governor, suggested he step down. And that created an opening once he stepped down. And J.C. Jatan, who was on the staff, he was doing some work on the state level as well. So he's one of those people running against Sarah DeMarchant, who is an entrepreneur who's come through the ranks and has developed companies. So that's going to be one we're going to be watching.
And then you look, and we talked about these battleground neighborhoods, if you remember, and these battleground streets for some of these House races now at the local level. One race in particular is the race for House District 132. Kalani out in Katy. She won in 2018. You've seen some of her ads, and there's ads that are going up negative against her as well. But she won in 2013, I believe, or 2018, I believe, by about 113 votes. It was very close.
Right. And who did she beat? Mike Schofield.
That's right.
The guy he's running against now. Mike said, okay, I lost, but I'm coming back. So they're right back.
It's the rematch. It's the rematch, right? And Schofield thinks that obviously he can come back in, and the Republicans feel they can come back and take one of those seats. So as we talk about Democrats having to flip 9 seats, it's important to also know they have to flip 9 seats while defending all of the seats they currently have in order to secure that advantage. And you'll talk to anybody in politics, and they'll tell you it's an advantage when you can redraw congressional districts, because then you're drawing them to your favor for down the road, at least for the next 10 years. So these little neighborhood races are interesting. I got off the phone with one of them, these House races, but they're really going into certain neighborhoods, because in the suburbs is where these battles are really being held in many states, not just ours, because you know that certain areas are going to vote one way already. So you got to go to these suburbs and go, and which is why you're seeing a lot of male figures holding babies or saying what kind of husbands they are and what kind of fathers they are, because they're trying to get after that motherly vote. Go ahead.
You bring that up, and that's exactly what you think of. You think of Wesley Hunt, who's in the commercial with his baby and his wife and moving. And by the way,
I'm just keeping it very. I'm not saying names. I'm just saying what's happening out there.
No. I don't have a problem saying names, because that's what's going on. That's the reality. Right, exactly. Republicans are really.
That's both sides. They're both trying to figure out, okay, who are the real undecideds here? Who can we really go after? And it's like, okay, well, they always want to try to get that mother. They always want to get that wife out there, because, you know, some of us can be like, we can have a difference of opinion with our wives, because let's face it, our wives know better in many ways.
Hey, they're the straw that stirs the drink. Many smart men will say that.
Hey, I know that he thinks he's going to do his thing, but I'm going to go do my thing. Yeah. And that's where you have these ads trying to go after, and these certain neighborhoods really trying to go in there and campaign hard to say, hey, if we can turn just a couple of streets, then, hey, you know what? We might get that 200 vote total in our favor to help make up for that 115 that we lost and actually win it a little bit easier this time. And it's interesting because, and I think I'm going to kind of circle back from the federal race. I got off the phone with Republicans and Democratic operatives here in the last hour. And I said, what has changed in the last week? And other people told me certain things. And in the last week of an election, you have the get out to vote. How good is your ground game to go in there and make sure that the people that you have targeted, the people that you've identified are they're going to be your voters, how sure you're going to go get them to the polls and they're going to vote for you. It's all called GOTV, get out to vote. But I was talking about what's happening in the big landscape of things, any messages, anything from the debate. And, you know, the proof that debates can have an impact. Even at the very end, they both pointed to the comment about the fossil fuels and the comments made by the vice president there. And one Democrat told me it alarmed a lot of Texans because it is about our culture. And let me go back in time to before the pandemic. We were getting hit from an economical vantage point in the economy here in Texas because oil was being sold at a very, very low price, while the rest of the nation might say, hey, great, oil's cheaper. It's going to make driving easier and more cost effective for us. Here in Texas, people, while you might look at it and say, hey, it's nice, the fact is people's jobs and livelihoods depend on it. And if it's cheaper, it's not good for our economy. So that's been one of the concerns here. If away from the pandemic, is the oil sector, the energy sector. Bringing these operatives told me alarmed a lot of Texans. It is about our culture. And I asked another person on the Republican side, how did it impact them? And they said, well, that was a key comment for us because it was a way for us to basically go back and say, hey, you see, this is This is really what it's all about at the end of the day. But now it forces the House races to go out and to defend them. Every single one of these House Republicans are, if you notice, not many of them are saying we're with Trump. Not many of them are showing them with the president. It's the other side that's saying so-and-so believes this and he'll stand with Trump. And what you're hearing from the other side is so-and-so believes in this. They stand with Pelosi.
Good
and
point.
Senator Schumer.
Good point. Good point.
And you know, when you think about that, at the end of the day, then you just look at what's really said about your backyard. And some of these candidates on the Democratic side make their living in the energy sector. And now they're having to say, listen, what was said nationally, I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen in Texas because I live here. And that's one of the challenges for people out there who are
one of the things that came out about that was that, of course, it got to fracking is what one of the conversations were. And of course, the president wanted to make sure that the fracking comment was very well heard for the folks in Pennsylvania and other states where fracking is big. But the vice president was talking about transitioning from fossil fuels a little bit more toward cleaner energy and solar and that sort of thing. But it would only cover the fracking part, as it turns out. As far as Texas is concerned, it's not that big of a deal because his comments would be only for federal lands where fracking would be kind of trimmed back. And Texas doesn't have any federal lands that are where fracking is going on. So it's a non-starter as far as the fracking piece is concerned. As far as the overall energy, that's another story. And I've always felt it's always been kind of conflicting for me because I love pumping my gas and seeing the gas being, $1.25 a gallon. But I know that for the energy sector here, they'd love for it to be higher than that. They love for the oil to be more expensive. And we know that around our area, this area has really taken a hit because of the oil sector and how the oil prices have gone so far down. That makes it a whole different ball game as well, as far as how it's being impacted, how the energy.
Khambrel, at the end of the day, we know that people, when they go into the polls come Tuesday morning, they vote with their bank accounts and what they have in their pocket on that day. In many instances, when they can't make up their mind. And
they've already made up their minds in so many different ways anyway, on so much because of the disparity and what's going on in the White House. Someone asked a question about with Senator Cornyn up by 4 or 5 points, and some polls are even higher than that. Why is he up by that much and Biden is down, not up? And it's all about the White House. John Cornyn is a much more likable Republican for Democrats than is Donald Trump for Democrats. It's just that's as simple as that. More than anything else.
I think a key point as I know that we're pushing 45 minutes in this conversation, it's been fantastic to be able to talk about this at great length, especially because I know that you enjoy discussing politics as much. And it's really intriguing because Texas, we're almost like a laboratory right now in terms of how things are changing up in so many ways here. But it's really intriguing when you look at a race like Senator Cornyn. And what's going on there in that you have a senator who's established, but you don't see him at all with the president in any of the ads, really, unless it's the opposition and MJ Hager. But when I asked people the following question on the story that I did a few weeks ago about campaign spending and what we're seeing, the vast amounts, I asked one question. I said, if President Trump wasn't bombastic with his delivery, if he wasn't the person that he was on social media, if he was just a generic politician, which again kind of works against him because people love him for what he is in terms of how he is in certain ways. I mean, that's what we have seen thus far. I said, would you see this kind of money being spent in Texas? And one person said right away, no, without a doubt. But because you have the last 4 years play out the way that they have, you're having a lot of people say, hey, I can look at it from this perspective and say, I'm going to go for this guy this time around, and I'm going to spend money to make sure that this other guy wins. And if it was a different type of candidate, you wouldn't have to worry about defending Texas. Again, that's coming from a Democratic strategist. Another one that I spoke to said, there's no doubt we're seeing the benefits of what's going on in Washington, according to them. I speak to a guy who used to work in politics who didn't vote in the 2016 cycle for President Trump, but he was telling me he's going to vote for President Trump this time around. And this individual said the reason why is because I don't think that he ever got a fair shake. What I'm trying to say is that in the last 4 years, you've seen so much out of Washington that people at the end of the day are voting by what they see up there. having the impact that it's having on their lives down here on the grounds.
And they're living in silos too, in partisan silos, quite frankly.
Right.
And so people are ingesting what they're going to ingest from the cable networks if they're not watching KPRC, for example.
Social media.
Somebody else wrote, yeah, social media, big deal as well. And of course, you have to be careful about that, because now social media, you don't know if you're looking at somebody who's got a legitimate concern, or you're looking at the Russians, or somebody else with the bots that are out there. So it really is a challenge with all that. Somebody else wrote, why isn't KPRC reporting about the voter fraud in San Antonio? Well, that's San Antonio, not here. But the other thing is that as we see legitimate voter fraud stories come up, and you're in investigates, Mario, so I know you guys are keeping an eye on all of that to see if there's anything going on that we need to talk about.
Listen, you know what?
On the radar here recently?
We run things down all the time, Khambrel. You know how it works.
Yeah.
And we examine things all the time. And it's very interesting times, because we've been getting a lot of phone calls about a variety of things right now. But I think the biggest significant component here is that we have yet to see, while we have seen warnings from the federal government, and we do know that law enforcement, I know personally that law enforcement have been meeting specifically about election frauds and everything with regards to what the election may entail that night. We haven't seen that major significant case yet that has emerged. We haven't seen any type of announcements of any type of charges being levied. So, and that's significant as we take everything into account. For example, and the one thing we heard over and over again, I think I told you, Khambrel, because I came back from Oregon, such a believer in this vote by mail ballot system, which was introduced by Republicans in Oregon. It wasn't introduced by Democrats. It was introduced by Republicans. They were the ones that wanted the all-mail ballots in Oregon originally. Why? Because Oregon had so many people in the rural sector, and they said, we have so many Republicans away from Portland. We would like for them to be able to vote easier. Let's create an all-mail system, which is what they did in Oregon 22 years ago. It's a fascinating story, and the way they do it there is really well done. And the key part about this, and there's no disputing this, because you can look at the facts, less than 100 people have been prosecuted for election fraud in Oregon in 22 years with their all-mail system.
Right. Yeah, it's out there. We know that. We've seen allegations have been hurled, but you're right. I mean, if there are charges out there, that's one thing. Allegations are quite the other. And so we keep an eye on it and know that it does exist, but we don't want to put ourselves in a position of being a megaphone for something that is not proven or not have any basis in fact behind it other than allegations.
You want to be real news, not fake news.
Yeah, good point. Glad you said that. So we've got, I want to mention another couple of House races here pretty quickly before we move on. We got about 10 more minutes here, Mario. See, what you don't know, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is that when Mario and I are in the newsroom, we have to move along, because we do this all the time about all kinds of topics, including our former careers in sports. But that's another whole ball game. So we've got another area where in House District 138, where Akila Basie is running against Lacey Hull. That's another one of those districts where a Republican stepped down. The Republican who was in there actually had won his race the last time he was out by about 47 votes. He said, okay, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. So now it's got Akila Basie and Lacey Hull fighting to keep that seat in GOP hands. And Lacey Hull has a lot of support from the gun rights folk and the homeschool folks. She's very on the far conservative side, and Akila Basie is obviously not. And so that's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. And so throughout this region, we have those. Also, one very important, I think, is Sarah Davis. Sarah Davis in House District 134. She is considered the most moderate Republican. You know that one, right?
And that is arguably the most influential House district in the state of Texas when you take who's there and what it encompasses. And that is a race. That is a race that is generating a ton of money being spent on this one. It's a HD 135, is it, or 134, Khambrel?
134.
134.
Yes. And because that was a Democrat, it was a Democratic seat when Ellen Cohen was in that seat a number of years ago, and she was defeated by Sarah Davis. And so Ellen Cohen left the House and became a Houston City Council member, and Sarah Davis has been there for since 2010. And so now she's got Ann
And,
Johnson.
and I was gonna say, and it's not uncommon. I mean, I was talking to somebody in that district. They said they have seen a house where you have a Biden sign and a Sarah Davis sign. She does have some crossover appeal. This is a race. I think of all the races in the House districts, and the one that's the most, this is one that has a lot of people talking in this area. And I'm glad you brought it up, Khambrel, because of the fact that there is so much money. And Sarah Davis, if you recall, in 2018, and I remember this because we were in an investigation into another House district seat at the time, and we had to go track down Governor Abbott to get his comments with regards to our investigation.
I know where you're going with
this.
What
I remember was that we tracked down Governor Abbott at a primary location for the primary vote because the governor had endorsed Sarah Davis's opponent, if you remember.
Yes, absolutely.
So what's interesting about Sarah Davis is that that's why she's able to have that some sort of appeal or that appeal that I mentioned where you have a Biden sign and a Sarah Davis sign, because she has gone against the party in many instances. But when it comes to elections like this, it's a challenge.
It is a challenge. And Ann Johnson, by the way, who's running against her now, has run against her before as well and lost by 9 points the last time she ran against Sarah Davis. But she's running in that area that includes the Montrose area. So we're talking about LGBTQ groups, that area, and Bel Air and West U and those areas that are fairly affluent. So there's a mixture of all of that. So very affluent. And plus, Mari, there's a lot going on within the Republican Party now in the state as well. You've seen the infighting that's going on between those who are far to the right, even against the governor. Remember, that wasn't long ago. They came out, the chair of the Republican Party came out and was leading a protest outside the governor's house, complaining about the fact that he was adding another week to early voting. Because he said, because of COVID, we want to give people a little bit more time. And he says, adding a week to early voting. And they were outraged about that because they wanted to keep it what it was, just whatever it is, make that happen. So even within the Republican Party, there's this kind of like unease. And so when you have a Sarah Davis, who is thought to be the most moderate Republican in the House, Republicans are willing to embrace her clearly to make sure they hold on to that seat in this very important time in this year.
Right. But campaign against her in the primary as it was in 2018.
Absolutely. With the governor campaigning against her as well. So the challenges will continue.
I think what's going to happen, Khambrel, is that I think everyone is going to wake up in terms of the parties come Wednesday morning, if we hopefully at that point do have a result to the election. And I say this because we still are uncertain about how this whole process is going to work with the counting of votes. And this is not me saying it, it's the experts that we have spoken to.
Right.
But I think that once that decision is finally rendered and we do have that concrete decision one way or the other, I think both parties are going to have to look in the mirror and say, okay, what are we going to do differently to make sure that we get the middle and the undecided? Because while there are people that are to this side and there are people that are to this side, the vast majority of people live right about here and interact right in here. And these are the people they want to get after with the votes. And that's the key thing for many people, because that's what decides elections these days.
And political scientists and campaign folk are crunching numbers like you wouldn't believe, trying to figure out what is going to be the key to get you to vote for them. And that's the same thing that's true in all of these areas. We talked about Wesley Hunt earlier. Lizzie Fletcher has been fairly aggressive and active within the oil industry, doing a lot of different things there on behalf of this community.
Control.
Right, but you wouldn't know that by the spots, the ads that are running against her. They say she's, not been doing anything. Well, what they've done, the Republican Party, they saw what happened in California. There was a special election for a congressional seat in California, and they put a guy up who ran and won, who was also kind of like Wesley Hunt, a minority, Hispanic, West Point, and now we have Wesley Hunt, African American, West Point, looks good and all that kind of stuff, family man. And so right out of central casting, it worked in the West Coast. Let's make it work here and try to get that seat back that George H.W. Bush held for so long and Culberson as well. So it's all about how they can make you just get your heartstrings and these commercials.
There's no doubt that candidates on both sides in that race have accomplishments, right? It's not easy It's not easy to get into certain universities in this country or certain certain institutions in this country. And there's no doubt there's an incredible story to be told on one side. And you look at the other side and the story isn't being completely told accurately. I do believe in that they are looking for a certain type of individual, but some of these individuals out there have accomplished a lot from certain vantage points. And at the end of the day, when you look at it all, you're trying to figure out, okay, who's really going to make the best decision for my family, right? And that's when you start looking at everybody's backgrounds and you start looking in. And, if someone went to West Point and their problem, then you're going to say, okay, well, maybe they might lean towards these areas that I believe in, and this is what they're going to stand for. If you look at Lizzie Fletcher, you say, no, she's coming from this background. This is it's going to come down, I think, to what people want for their families and what they need for their families. Because there are those people out there that are not willing to vote party lines on everything, Khambrel.
Yeah. One of the things too, Mario, before we finish up for this wonderful hour we've been doing, questions have come up about COVID and how that's being handled. Whether or not there are, and I think that they've done a really good job. The people at the polls have been socially distanced. They are wearing masks and shields. Typically, some of them are wearing masks and shields, some of them not. I go to a place where I know it to be not very many people voting, so I go there, but everybody's wearing masks, and the voters, the booths are separate as well. And I know that you don't touch anything. They give you a little stylus, or sometimes they give you a little something to cover your finger if you have to push like that. But I had a little stylus that I could touch, and then I could throw it away as I left. So they are being very socially distanced as they're asking people to come out. And obviously on election day, it's going to be a little bit more challenging because depending on how many people come out, everybody's still going to be socially distanced. So whatever you used to do standing in line, you're going to have 6 feet between you and the next person there. It is what it is.
My wife voted with our son standing beside her, and it's a reminder that you can't have children standing right beside you when you vote. I mean, something, at least in our case, we did.
Yes.
Just walk.
Yes.
So,
well, yeah. My 7-month-old granddaughter went with her mother and father to vote as well. So you're actually right.
So my little boy, I'm like, you're going to go in here and you're going to go watch this because this is important. So he was 8 years old. I'll probably never forget that. But there are parents who are, what should I do? And they're concerned. And those are rightful concerns. But I'm just letting you know.
Well, you keep everybody safe. That's for sure, no matter what you do. Mario, it's been great. Had this conversation with you. Anytime you want to talk politics, just give me a phone call. You have my cell number. We can talk like crazy. But I hope that those folk who are able to join the webinar will be able to ask, and we'll go on and answer your questions as well before we get done. We're going to answer all the questions that are here.
And I want to thank you if you're watching from another state, obviously within the Grand Media Group, whether that be Michigan, whether it be Virginia, whether it be down in the great state of Florida, all battleground states. And you're wondering what might be going on in Texas, or if you're watching us here in the Houston area, if you don't mind, you can follow Khambrel and I on social media. I'm at KPRC2 Mario. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. You can also find me via Twitter. My email is very simple. It's my last name, Diaz, first initial, last name at kprc.com. If you have any questions for me, I'm sure Khambrel's going to weigh in with his socials. Please, by all means, reach out to us. We're more than happy to answer any questions with regards to this. Sometimes we don't know the answer, but what we promise we can do is we can try to find one as quickly as possible for you.
You are always a promoter, just spoken like a true promoter, Mario. KPRC2 Khambrel, both Facebook and Twitter. kmarshall@kprc.com.
And make sure that, during the course of between now and Tuesday, we're probably going to have a little bit more of these webinars with regards to the election. Tuesday night coverage is going to be starting here early as soon as we'll have the polls closing. I know Khambrel will be a part of that as well as I will. So just make sure that for the very latest, you might want to download that app now, start following us. You can find it all.
We're starting right at, I think we're going to be starting right at 6:30 on election night with our online live. We'll be on throughout the evening all the way up until, so network is going to be doing their thing. We'll be breaking on TV, but online live. I have a couple of the former Harris County chair of the GOP on, and former Houston City Council member Carol Robinson, and also Mark Jones, who's a political scientist from Rice University, and former Harris County Judge Ed Emmett on as well. All a part of that. Will be with you throughout the evening on Tuesday night, election night. If you haven't voted and you haven't taken advantage of early voting, please do so. It's a
Khambrel,
right. Yes.
Khambrel, you got the show Sunday. Who's coming on?
Senator John Cornyn is my guest on Sunday. John is Senator Cornyn is running against MJ Hagar, of course, and the polls have indicated it's close, 4 to 5 or 6 to 7 points, depending on who you're looking at. But a closer race than he'd want to have. Very interesting conversations. I asked him about the Supreme Court and why they made that a priority as opposed to COVID relief. And as the president was talking about, we've turned the corner. If he also believed we've turned the corner in the fight against COVID, very interesting responses. In fact, I'll put one of those on my Facebook page today. So lots going on. Sunday Newsmakers, Houston Newsmakers with Khambrel Marshall, Sunday morning at 10:30. So between all of that and those social media things that we've given you now, you got no excuse to not stay in contact. Shall we do that? Thank you, Mario. Thank you for what you do, brother. Take care. Everybody, we've enjoyed you. We'll continue to answer your questions offline, but thank you for joining us.